Okay, welcome to the afternoon session here at Seattle Pacific University. We have three speakers today. Professor Nani Skaggs from Northwestern Christian University, and her paper is Other Minds, Understanding Omniscience and a Perspective-Taking Task. She's teaching, as I said, in Eugene, is where the university is, and she has some background in, I found interesting, adolescent psychology, autonomy, and addiction studies. 3 daughters who are adolescents, so we'll be talking about that later. Our second speaker will be Laird, Edman, whose paper with Kirsten McConnell is entitled, he's of Northwestern College. The title of the paper is Too Weird or Just Weird Enough? The Counter-Intuitiveness of Christian Theological Concepts. And some of his, he teaches again at Northwestern University in Iowa. And a couple of the works that he's worked on that caught my mind have to do with are people ready, and when are they ready, and how do we know to learn how critically to think? So that's very interesting. And he had some time at University of Notre Dame, where I went as well. So we'll be missing some of the football game, so you know we're making supreme sacrifices to be here. And then our last speaker is Professor Markuly, who is Dean School of Theology at Seattle University. His paper is entitled CSR and Religious and Theological Education, Implications, Impediments, and Strategies for Deeper Dialogue. And he has also spent some time teaching in New Orleans and talking about setting up education systems in the wake of Katrina. So it really stood out as important work. All right, Nani, thank you very much for your patience.
There we go. Can you hear me? So it wasn't what I was planning on talking about, but in a nutshell, parental monitoring and knowing who your kids hang out with will help keep them from a more pro-social path. So you could do that. So I'm talking about other minds because, and we've talked a lot about theory of mind, and I'm going to talk about it some more. But the idea is that we develop an idea that other people have thoughts, but how is it that it gives rise to us understanding God who is all-knowing? And so is there something about Tom that allows us to be able to think about divine minds and having omniscience? So the question broadly is, can we think of other minds as being all-knowing? And are there limits to that ability? And so theory of mind, as we know, and if you've read Justin's work or his book, Born Believers, we know that kids develop this theory of mind by the time they're 4 or 5 years of age. Before this age, they think that what I know, everybody else knows. But then they start to realize that others can have private thoughts, private beliefs. But what's interesting is even though we talk about the fact that theory of mind use develops by the time we're 4 or 5 years of age, we're really bad at using it even as adults. And so we talked about, or last night Bob talked about this idea that Tom use is natural, and something that's natural may then be influenced by intrusions. And so I'm wondering if there's something along those lines, and I'll get to that, of why we don't continue to use Tom effectively throughout development. Renee Bejan and others have gone so far as to call it psychological reasoning, but I don't think the reasoning means that they're actually reflectively doing this as they're learning to take others' perspectives. But that they're, what we're learning when we develop theory of mind is attributing mental states to others. And again, I think there's 2 types of these, relational and informational, and so I'm focusing on information. What do we think about when what other people are doing, what information they have available to them? Okay, so we can have reality congruent information, or we can have reality incongruent information. And this goes along the lines with, I think, Adam's talk, is the curse of knowledge. Birch and Bloom found that in a false belief task, when participants knew the movement of an object to a different location versus a group that knew the object had been moved but didn't know where it was moved, that then when they asked where the object could be so let me back up and say, so Denise has a violin, and Denise puts the violin in a blue box. She leaves. Her sister, Kelly, comes in and moves the violin from the blue box to a red box. And then what happened is the colored boxes, there were 4 of them, were moved. So now the red box is in the blue box location, the blue box is in the red box location. So you follow me? So one group isn't told that the violin has been moved to the red box, but it was. And another group was told it was moved to the red box, and they asked, well, where will Denise look when she comes back? And those who had knowledge plausible, who knew where the violin had moved, had a higher probability that Denise would look in the red box. And the reason for that, they think, is because there was a rationale for that. The red box now sat in the location of the blue box, right? So it's this curse of knowledge. And you didn't see the same thing happening in the ignorant condition or the knowledge implausible, that it was actually the violin in the knowledge implausible case was moved to a purple box, but the red box was in the blue box location, the blue box had been moved. And nobody said, oh, it's in the red box, because the red box now shares the location of the blue box. Okay, so it kind of goes to this idea that what we know maybe influences what we think other people know. So, in an interesting study, In the Mood to Get Over Yourself, and this, I'm going to talk about this because this is what I used for my study, but Kazar and Barr developed a communications game where there are 16 slots. 5 of the slots are blocked from the viewer of another person. So if you can imagine someone sitting on the other side of this grid, they can't see what's behind the occluded box. And so this is what's called an experimental condition where the competitor's present. So there's a critical instruction, move the small candle, made by the director sitting on the other side. If I know the director can't see it, then that's not the referent. The referent should be this small candle here, okay? And then what you do is you run control trials where you still have a critical instruction, move the small candle, but there's no competitor present. So I'll be using the term competitor present, competitor absent, okay? What was interesting in this particular study is they were interested in whether or not mood plays any role in perspective taking. And so what they did in this study, which is what I did because we don't have fancy equipment to measure eye gaze and tracking, but they simply used grabbing the object to determine whether or not the person selected that object, and that reaction time was an error if they grabbed the competitor when it was the competitor present, okay? So what they found actually, and I think I'll do a study where I make everybody sad, is they found that when you're happy, you actually take longer to grab the right object. And again, it's that perhaps when we're happy, we're less likely to take someone's perspective. So the individuals, the participants in this study, made more errors or took longer to reach the correct target in this case, okay? Here's the neutral condition and the sad condition. Kazar and Barr suggest that when someone's talking to us, addressees use private thoughts rather than the perspective of the speaker for potential reference, and that the egocentric view can occur for speakers and addressees, but adults have difficulty using theory of mind. So even though it's something we develop, we still have trouble using it. So in an online version, this is the gold standard what I'd like to move toward, because I think it would help with larger sample sizes, but Ian Apperly and Dumenthal and others have used this online usage of theory of mind. And again, here's the same situation. Here's the director. Here's the matcher's view. So if you were looking at this, it would be your view. You're shown the director's view, so you're shown that you can't see the objects on the other side. Here's the experimental trial. Here's the distractor or the competitor present. Here's the competitor absent trial. Okay, so you can do this on a virtual or online way as well. And what Dumenthal found was, looking at age, is again she found errors. So in the director condition where the competitor's present, kids make about 80% errors. And then as we age, and going up to adults, this is a cross-sectional study, but adults still make errors. Okay, so they still are making errors in this theory of mind task. What's interesting, though, is kids are faster at making the errors, and adults, and you see some problems in a no director control and experimental group, which was just following rules. But the adults tend to, even though they make mistakes in TOM, they don't take longer to find the right competitor object. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. So Apperly used an ignorant and informed condition in his task and found, again, that participants make fewer errors in an informed director condition. And this is important because this is where I varied it. His informed director they were told that the informed director is seeing the grid from the same side as the matcher, the one who's the participant in the study, okay? And he goes on to say that the egocentric strategy is easier than considering someone else's perspective on reality. So it's easier for us to use our own knowledge, right? Okay, so self-perceptive is the default. Kazar and Barr went on to say that comprehending utterances from our own, we tend to comprehend utterances from our own perspective, and then we have to adjust for any errors that arise. So for my study, so that's the background, but for my study, I used the grid set up by Kazar and others, the 4x4 array. It was in a lab. I didn't use the virtual one. 5 occluded slots from the director's view, 11 mutually open slots. There were 8 experimental instructions, so 8 trials where there was a competitor present. There were 8 trials where the competitor was absent. They were arranged in such a way that there was no 2 types of trials occurred more than twice consecutively, and then the order was randomized between participants. There were 32 filler instructions, so they had to move other objects in the grid as well. But there was a target that we were measuring for each of the trials. And so again, there's the critical instruction, move the small cup up. The confederate the director in my study was either another person, a confederate, someone working with me, or it was a computer. Okay, the computer sat on the other side of the grid. And they read critical instructions, so just use natural reader, and all the instructions were written there, and the computer just read the directions the same way that the human confederate did. The participant was referred to as the matcher because they're matching the instructions of the director. And so I had 3 groups. I had the ignorant director group. The matcher was told that the ignorant director did not know what was in the occluded slots. I had an informed human, so the participant was told the human was referring to all slots, and I specifically ended the instruction with saying, remember, the director is all-knowing. And then I did the same thing for the computer. I said, now, the computer is going to give you instructions to move objects. The computer is all-knowing, okay? So again, I'm just going to show you this again. So here's the experimental trial with the competitor present. So imagine there's a person sitting over here. I moved the chair so the picture would look better, but there was a chair here, and there was either a computer on the other side, or there was a person sitting here, and you would be sitting in the way you're viewing this right now, okay? And this is a control condition. So the trials were the same, just what was changed were the types of objects in each of the displays and the competitor being present or absent. This was the director's view. Now, methodologically, this particular study I did this last year, and I had the participant look at this view before we started the study. I didn't do it this year, and I now wish I had, but it means more studies, right? Okay, so, and I'll talk about why that is in a moment. But Apperly I just wanted to reiterate that in Apperly's online version, here's the director, and here's his informed director. So the matcher was told, the informed director is seeing this from the same side you are. So can you see that? And so I'm making the informed director actually be this person in my study. All right. So participants told the informed director, person or computer, facing them on the other side was all-knowing. This is reality incongruent for the human director because the other person we can't see through things, right? So if a human's sitting on the other side, they can't see objects. So this is considered reality incongruent. Participants, 49 college students. It's a convenient sample, NCU students, 34 female, 15 male, median age 20 years. More than 50% of them consider themselves highly religious. The conditions were the ignorant human, the informed computer, and the trial, whether the competitor was present or absent. And I also was interested in gender because, again, there's been some suggestion that females are better at taking perspectives. Behavioral measures, I measured the number of trials and errors were made. This was difficult to do because I said we were going to measure reaching for a competitor, but it was hard to determine when the reach started from our videos. So I'm just going to talk about when they actually touched and grabbed the object. Okay. No gender differences. There were no order effects, so no, it didn't matter what order you got the trials. But there was a significant condition by trial type. And so more errors were made in the competitor present than competitor absent trials. Okay, so yes, of course, there was a competitor. But what's interesting is that the ignorant directors, look at the errors in the ignorant director. People had a hard time taking the ignorant director's perspective. They made an error because they chose the present competitor. But what's interesting is in the informed human director condition and the informed computer, there were also errors in the experimental trial. And anecdotally, one of the participants in the informed computer condition said, well, I just kept imagining there was somebody on the other side of the table. And so it's not I thought maybe the informed computer would have no errors, but there were errors. And the informed human makes sense that there would be some errors because the reality is it's a person sitting there. So even if I'm told the person's all-knowing, then I should still take into account the reality that they don't know what's hidden. Okay, so there are a few errors there as well. But what's interesting is there's no difference in reaction time between competitor present and competitor absent trials, which is and this is just for correct trials. So this is interesting because Kazar and Barr say that when we're taking someone else's perspective, we anchor on our egocentric perspective, we notice an error, and then we adjust. So I was thinking it would take us longer then to reach the target, and it doesn't. I mean, we're really quick when we take someone's perspective to reach the right target. But we make errors in doing it. So it's interesting that when we are correct, we do it really quickly. We're not slower than the informed human and the informed computer condition because they don't have to worry about that. They don't have to make that error adjustment. So I think that's interesting. And maybe you can tell me whether it is or not. So conclusion, participants in the ignorant director condition did not use the perspective of the ignorant director. There's an interference between perceptive of self and other. And it may be that holding other minds in mind and following the directions of someone else are costly. Therefore, Tom use is prone to errors. So the egocentric strategy of thinking what I know others know may result in the ease of thinking about omniscience. And so what I really want to do next, since this is Christianity natural, is I really wanted to study how students would do, or participants, if I was asking them to follow God's directions and then compare that to Jesus's directions and see, how we take those perspectives. So that's kind of where I would like to go. The other thing we talked about earlier this morning was, I think Adam brought up making something strategic. Like if there was something good hidden in there or there was some kind of payoff and some kind of competition between the matcher and the director, maybe it would change how we take someone else's perspective. I think we'd become maybe I don't know, if we made it that you both benefit, maybe we'd have better perspective taking. I'm not sure, but that's where I'd like to go. And then another interesting study was done where the competitor object was actually placed in a brown bag and then put in the grid in the occluded slot. And sometimes people still grab that as the referent target from the director. So there's a lot of interesting things to be done with this, and if you have, I'd like to thank Carly. She helped me with data collection, methodology, Dr. Steve Kaludis, and other students that are in my lab. Yes, Danielle.
Using the word director was problematic because maybe they assume that the director is always all-knowing and set it up and knows where it is. Like my mom calls me all the time from my house and says, "Where's your mixer?" And I'm like, "Go to the cabinet." So I'm not seeing anything, but she just assumes I know where it is. Could it be the case you're not finding much of a difference because the director is always all-knowing?
I think what was happening is that a couple of things. The first time I did this study, we went through a lot of deception. We made the Confederates show up at the same time as the participant, and here you're both here for a study. We did a lot of deception, and we had them pick a paper out of a box that said matcher, but the director knew to say, I got director, and participant, I got matcher. And we did a lot of that to set it up so that the participant believed the director was naive. And I think what we didn't do that this time. And I think we may have introduced a rationale. Well, this person is already here, therefore they must know what's behind here because. Yeah, we called him the director. But we did try. So there are methodological issues. One of the other things, the Confederates were told not to give away the location of the object by eye gaze, so they kept their eyes down. Because eye gaze is one way that we take someone's perspective, right? What are they looking for? So we tried to keep it that it was just red directions. And I think because also we didn't show them what the other person saw to prime. Can I use the word prime? To prime that those slots were actually blocked. We didn't do that this time.
Or it could be that the person thinks the director is taking their position. So you're over there telling me instructions, and I assume that you're telling me what I'm supposed to be doing from my point of view because you're telling me what.
No, we clearly, for the ignorant condition, we said the person does not know what's behind the occluded slots. And what's interesting is Markuly did a study where they just had to follow a rule. The director is not, if the object's behind a gray screen, then the director is not referring to that. And people made no errors on that. They could remember that rule. But when you do the ignorant condition and it's a human giving directions, they default to their egocentric perspective. So yeah. Yes.
Just a quick comment. One of the papers that you cited, one of the co-authors was McConnel, and he's got this other study that sort of at least nicely resonates with what you're getting, and that is asking people what God thinks about a variety of topics, any number of things, right? And then asking them about what various other people think and then what they think. And it turns out God thinks what they think. But the crucial part of this is that then he goes through a manipulation where he changes what they think, and they're unaware of the fact that he's influenced what they think. Retests them, and sure enough, God's changed his mind as well.
Oh, interesting.
Kind of redoing the favor of God creating us in his image, and so we kind of redo it back.
Yeah, we have time for another question or two.
Yeah.
So, I guess I'm trying to work through this, and so this isn't quite coherent yet. So, here we go. The thing there's something that I feel like we put into any situation where we say, this is what God wants, or any, so it's the sort of thing that Bob could say, this is what Justin wants to me, and I'll believe Bob on that. But if Bob says, this is what God wants, and it has anything to do with me, I'm going to be asking follow-up questions in a different way. And I guess I wonder to what extent...
God wants you to be good.
All right, well, there we go. But does this make sense? It seems like we've got different criteria for trusting perspective taking of others, and how we allocate whether or not we're going to ask follow-up questions, demand coherence, these sorts of things are a little bit related. So I wonder, sort of from a metacognitive level, are people actually getting some of that? Can they do good assessment of how they're doing, such that they could move to sort of that rule situation? And if that would actually have any bearing on the differences between trying to take perspectives of others or doing sort of second-order relations about taking God's perspective.
Well, again, anecdotally, in debriefing, I'd say to some of the ignorant directors, do you remember what you were told? And they'd say, to move objects. And I said, do you remember I told you that the director did not know the objects in the hidden locations? They'd be like, oh. And so I thought, that, well, a couple of things I thought. One is, I thought, well, what if we had an ignorant director condition where if they make an error and they move an object that suddenly shows up and the director doesn't know it's there, they go, where'd that come from? Because that's what happens. They move something into a slot that now the director can see, but the director doesn't give feedback in my study. The director just says, move something, and they move it, and then we go on to the next command, or direction. So I'm wondering if maybe feedback would get them back to thinking about perspective taking. Because I think what happens is they don't hold the other person's mind in mind because they're so worried about quickly and accurately moving the target that they think the director's referring to. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. Adam?
Last question.
Okay.
This comes in the category of suggestions from the vulgar again. So you're talking about omniscience and the ease of coming up with that category, but of course omniscience covers a lot more than just the perception of objects. So it would be really interesting to see if you could come up with structurally parallel ways of getting at other kinds of information, like insight into what will happen or something like that. Like maybe there's a causal factor that's occluded, or I guess that's also perceptual. But it'd be interesting if you found a way to measure parallel whether some kinds of thinking about omniscience for some kinds is easier than other kinds. It obviously seems like omniscience is such a broad category that we'd expect some parts to be more natural than others. I just wonder if you can find something similar to this to measure this other kinds.
I'll try.
Just from vulgar again.
No, I mean, the big thing was just to, the idea that can we imagine someone, knowing information that violates what's happening in reality, and we can, so what's the next step, and maybe comparing it to some others. I'll talk more with you about that. Some ideas. Yeah, Danielle.
Would it help if you had the participant?
Danielle, you probably for 1 second. Just a second. Could Laird come set up?
Kirsten?
And then while they're setting up, we'll keep rolling.
Would it help if you had the participant try to tell your informed person what to do? And see what they tell them they're trying to do from their perspective? And code how they talk to them? So they have to constantly be thinking, what is this person? How am I going to direct this person to do something?
Well, we tried that in our pilot study. We had the matcher. We actually had the grid set up, and then we gave them another grid of how we wanted the grid set up, and had the person try to match it. And it was quite difficult, but maybe we could do something like that instead of having a script with the instructions. Just give them a picture of how we want the matrix to be set up.
Right, like that person, the participant becomes the director directing the person what to do or something. I don't know.
No, you need the participant to be the matcher because they're the ones that have to find the target object, right? Or I guess we could have the matcher see everything and the director. I'll let Laird go because I need to think about this. Yes, I will. Are you going to wear it or Laird?
I have a handout. I have 19 of them, and there are 27 of you in the room, so 7 of you will have to share. And if you really don't care a lot about theological concepts, then you don't need to take one. So, all right, as those are going around, I'll just do the introduction. This is Kirsten McConnel, who graduated from Northwestern last year. She has been my teaching assistant, my research assistant, kind of a really key principal investigator with me on a lot of this work. I had a small grant to pay her to work over the summer on this stuff. She's graduated and has another job, but still is participating in doing this research. I say all of this for those of you who may be affiliated with a graduate school at all. If you would like someone who will probably be, famous someday as a researcher, as a graduate of your graduate school, approach Kirsten. afterwards. She's applying for grad school this fall. So, and again, those of you who were involved in the conference, the CSR conference at Calvin, when I first introduced this project, the opening slide called it an exercise in hubris. That assessment hasn't changed. And so you'll get a sense of that. Justin Baird, on the very first day of that seminar, 2.5 years ago or so, said, cognitive science of religion, this growing, really fascinating area in the study of religion, has, to that point anyway, mostly been focusing on sort of theoretical constructs about religion, but very little has sort of looked at how does this translate into understanding this particular religion, a particular religion. Can we take these theories and apply them to, say, Christianity? If we can and they work, so much better for the theory. If we take the theories and apply them to a major, highly developed world religion and they don't really work, so let's think about doing that. So that was the impetus behind this entire study. Can we apply CSR theories directly to Christian thought and theology?
All right, so can you all hear me? Okay, so I know a lot of people here have done research in counterintuitiveness, so I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but just a brief overview. So this study is investigating the effects of counterintuitiveness on memory and transmission of theological concepts. So intuitive expectations about how the world works are evident by early childhood. So concepts, events, and objects can range from intuitive, so not define any intuitive expectations, to minimally counterintuitive, defining one or more, or one to maximally counterintuitive, defining 2 or more intuitive expectations. So for something to be counterintuitive, 2 or more of the ontological category must be violated that are set in place by early childhood. And this is cross-cultural as well. So the 5 ontological categories are spatiality, physicality, biology, animacy, and mentality. So minimally counterintuitive concepts have been shown to be more readily remembered over time, as well as more likely to be transmitted to others. Thus, it has been proposed that religious minimally counterintuitive concepts are more likely to be remembered and transmitted than other concepts. So, up until now, the effects of counterintuitive concepts on memory and transmissions have been tested only using concrete objects. So, we wanted to adapt Baird's 2008 coding scheme to abstract theological concepts. So the present study is seeking to create a coding scheme for intuitiveness for abstract theological concepts based on Baird's scheme for concrete religious concepts, and then use that scheme to code 20 different abstract theological concepts, and then predict based on level of counterintuitiveness which concepts will be easy for students to remember across time and which will not. Which brings us to our hypotheses. So for hypothesis number 1, the researchers' prediction of which concepts are most intuitive, minimally counterintuitive, and maximally counterintuitive will match the prediction of the expert writers. And for hypothesis number 2, participants will remember the minimally counterintuitive concepts more accurately than other concepts.
Which brings us to the friggin' concepts. So in study 1 and study 2, essentially we spent time bothering the theologian on campus. In the religion department, there's the theologian, there's the Old Testament guy, there's the New Testament guy, there's the worship person, and so we bothered the theologian and said, okay, when you teach Intro to Theology, what are some sort of central theological concepts that you teach in Intro to Theology? He gave us these 5, because we specifically asked, what are some concepts that have different approaches to them. And so he gave us these 5 concepts and then spent time with our research team talking through the different concepts within those 5, or the different sort of theological positions attached to those 5 theological concepts. Because we wanted to test abstract theological concepts that have different positions, because that way we could sort of just rank order them in terms of counterintuitiveness and then predict which of these will students remember better than others. See if it works for Christian abstract theology. And that was the, okay, let's try this. So the prediction based on Boyer's theory, we thought that the MCI positions would be remembered more accurately than the sort of the more intuitive positions and then the maximally counterintuitive positions. Now we realize that we run into a little problem because both Barrett and Markuly say all religious concepts are at least minimally counterintuitive. Right? Do you say that? I thought I found that someplace. So what we kind of thought is, well, but some feel much more intuitive. I mean, when you have students who all start with the assumption there is a God, and our students all start with that assumption, then some theological concepts feel fairly intuitive. Some feel fairly counterintuitive. And so we were, okay, let's play with this. Let's see how this works. And so what you have, the thing I handed out was, I thought, well, you might want to know what concepts we were looking at. What were we playing with? And those of you who may not be from a Reformed background may take issue with some of these. I'll blame our theologian. And so these are the concepts. One of them, God's power and providence. And there's the Augustinian position, the Molinist or / Arminian position, the open position, and the process position. We coded these, the Molinist is sort of the more intuitive one. The Arminian position was the more kind of easy default. The Augustinian was minimally counterintuitive, and then the open and process is maximally. How the heck did we come up with the coding? Well, we spent months just reading articles, summarizing articles to each other about folk biology, folk psychology, folk sociology, and intuitive morality. And thinking about, okay, these aren't concrete objects. Barrett's coding scheme, he says, okay, it's for concrete objects, we can't deal with abstract stuff. And we thought, okay, we're gonna jump in right into the fire, deal with some abstract theological stuff. But how would you think an abstract theological concept, how would you deal with whether this is intuitive or not? Well, how does it deal with sort of an intuitive notion of social exchange? How does it deal with an intuitive notion of free will? Well, how did we figure out what the intuitive notion of free will? Well, Kirsten started playing around with some articles in experimental philosophy. But it was, but the experimental philosophers pretty much said that the compatibilist position is the intuitive position, and that's where people kind of just sort of go without thinking about it or reflecting on it. That sort of, yes, I have free will. Well, not in everything, but I have free will. And so this sort of thing. And I sort of added on the top of this, paradox is maximally counterintuitive. That there are all kinds of Christian theological positions that when you get down to it, you say, well, it's just a paradox. Those are the ones that people go, yeah, I'm having trouble with that one. 3, 1, 3 gods, 1 God, it's a paradox. So it was things like that. And then we spent time in the research team. We broke into small groups. Everyone came up with their coding. We got together and matched coding. And where we had discrepancies, we spent a lot of time arguing. And that's how we came up with our coding scheme. It was just that we were exploring, is this possible? So that's how we came up with the coding scheme. So God's power and providence, coded that way. Effects of sin. The Pelagian is fairly intuitive. Arminian is minimally counterintuitive. The Reformed and Augustinian, maximally counterintuitive. Because you are born in sin, and it's like, no, I'm not. Okay, the purpose of the atonement, the example thing. God is, Jesus is our example, and we follow. There was the kind of the easy, intuitive thing. The penal and commercial were both minimally counterintuitive. The Christus Victor and the recapitulation more maximally counterintuitive. God's knowledge, this was the one that it was most fun. The Augustinian and the Arminian were both seemed minimally counterintuitive, but a little bit more so or a little bit less so, but we couldn't separate them out. And then the open and the process view, those are maximally counterintuitive. Original righteousness, the Augustinian, we couldn't come up with something we agreed on this one. So essentially we said, this one is complete. I mean, the whole study is exploratory, but this one is way exploratory. Let's throw it in and see what happens, because we couldn't figure out how to code this one very well. So this was sort of our initial coding on this. We knew the open and the process on original righteousness were pretty counterintuitive, but the Augustinian and Molinist, and so we couldn't come up with good justifications here. So that was our coding, yeah.
It doesn't have to match the handout for original righteousness.
Oh, shoot. Is
It's
it?
got Augustinian, Thomist,
It's on the back.
Liberal.
Oh. Is it on the back? Is it,
No, different words.
Pelagian and liberal.
Well, I'll just say, oops.
Is it the same, it's a copy-paste thing from the first?
Oh, all right. So the slide is wrong. What I have in my notes is the Augustinian was sort of 0, 1. The Thomist was kind of a 1 plus. Pelagian a 1 or 0. The liberal was a 2. Was how we kind of, but we disagreed with each other so much that we couldn't come up with a thing. So sorry. All right.
All right, so we did 2 studies. For study 1, we had 5 participants.
Send it out to more than that, but this is how many we got back.
Right. We asked the theologians at Northwestern, or the people who taught theology, to participate in this one. So they were our expert raters, and they scored a list of the theological constructs on 2 dimensions. So the difficulty for students to learn the concepts, and then the difficulty to teach the concepts. And then we predicted which constructs would be scored as most difficult based on degree of counterintuitiveness. So for this one, partially supported, and I say that because 10 of the 20 concepts received the exact same average memorability rating by the experts as was generated by our coding scheme. But it was statistically significant, but not statistically valid since we only had 5.
Yeah, we didn't have enough in the chi-square. We didn't have enough in each cell. So it's like,
so
you can't really believe that.
You want to do this when we do it again. So yeah, if you want to, probably don't have time to go into the 10 of the 20 that were, but we can get into that later afterwards if you have that question. For study 2, we had 54 participants. These were students at Northwestern, so 18 to 24 years old, pretty even for male and female. So for this one, we did a repeat measure. So in time 1, they had 10 minutes to look over and memorize terms and definitions.
They had the sheets in your hand.
Yeah, they had those exact same sheets. And then we did a matching quiz, just kind of as another way to make sure that they, knew the concepts and terms and everything. And then we graded them together as a group and then said, okay, now that you know these, look over them for another minute. And now you're going to write them out. We had the terms in bold and then lines underneath, and they wrote out the definitions next to the terms. Kind of grueling. And then 1 week later, we made them do it again. We sat them down, and they wrote out the definitions, and then they did the matching quiz, and we did the debriefment and everything. So.
And they did complain about what we were making them do.
We made them really good food.
Yes. So the hypothesis that participants will remember the MCI concepts more accurately than others. On God's power and providence, we did a repeat measures ANOVA and then planned comparisons on each of the 5 theological concepts. And there were no differences found among participants' memory scores on the 4 concepts. And what we discovered is we had a floor effect. That is, there were a lot of people who in a week later said, no clue.
Or just left it blank.
Or, yeah, so it's like, okay, we need a different manipulation because we're expecting too much of them. And that was okay, well, you do these studies to figure out how to do these studies. So no difference there, but on the effects of sin, yeah. Differences were found, and the pairwise comparisons were entirely in our predicted direction. That was kind of fun. On the purpose of the atonement, yes, differences were found, and the pairwise comparisons revealed that they were in the predicted direction mostly. That is, the two concepts coded as MCI were the best remembered. The two concepts coded as maximally counterintuitive were the least well remembered, but the one coded as intuitive was remembered just as well as the MCI. So, on knowledge of God, not supported, there just were no differences found among their memory scores. Again, perhaps a floor effect, I don't know. On original righteousness, yes, there were differences, but they were contrary to the predicted direction. That is, the concept that we coded as maximally counterintuitive was the best remembered. Dang. On, that's all of them. So, conclusion of this first foray into the place where angels fear to tread. So results of the present study offer mixed support for the coding scheme developed for the work, very mixed, and for Boyer's theory. Barrett's method of coding, counterintuitiveness of concrete religious objects. We think this was a first step in figuring out how can we translate this theory into abstract theology, because if we're going to use this theory to think about Christian faith, you pretty much have to start thinking abstract theological concepts eventually. And of course, to this date, little work has been done in attempting to translate this. As far as I know, no work has been done in trying to translate this into more abstract theological concepts or to apply it to the world's major religions. Maybe there's been some work on applying the MCI theory to the major world religions. I don't know of any. If someone knows, please tell us. Boyer's theory has been tested with concepts that could be religious, counterintuitive elements and stories that involve superhuman agent or supernatural object of some kind, or with the religious beliefs of sort of pre-literate societies. But if Boyer's theory is to be well supported, it must be tested on concepts and theologies of larger, more complex religious communities. So the current study is an attempt to try to do that. The mixed results indicate, well, okay, a start, maybe a good start, but at least a start. Obviously more work has to be done. The work needs to focus on the coding scheme that we started playing with, and we need to, that's the piece that is the least defensible of what we did, is that coding scheme. Maybe there's some methodology issues too, but how can we figure out a better way of thinking about how do we justify our coding other than, well, that feels intuitive. And it may also be that abstract theological concepts are multidimensional, and thus the theory itself doesn't map very well on them. I don't know. Maybe the nature of theologies that have developed over millennia of contemplation and theological writing doesn't work very well for this. These theological concepts in most situations require a great deal of cultural scaffolding. So maybe thinking about them in terms that are maturationally natural doesn't work. Maybe we're dealing with practiced natural stuff from the get-go, and therefore the MCI theory doesn't quite fit. I don't know. We're thinking about this. Perhaps the theological concepts are all maximally counterintuitive, and thus should be measured against concepts that are much simpler. This would require more research into folk theology. And I don't know, is there such a thing as folk theology? On the other hand, the current study did offer partial support for both the coding scheme and Boyer's theory, and the congruence of the experts' ratings with the concepts and the predictions about these concepts is heartening. So it may be that the original attempt to teach participants the concepts was not effective. And so the participants' memory of the concepts a week after the teaching session was so bad as to lead to difficulty in making any assertions about the concepts. And it may be more powerful teaching intervention isn't required. Maybe problems with the methodology. It was dull and insipid, according to our participants.
I got that comment a lot.
So floor effects may be there. And some people got all of them wrong. And a number of people got many of them wrong. So.
Do I have time for this quick?
Real quick.
Okay, so current directions. So we're still working on this right now. So we're thinking about possibly revising our methodology to make it a little more interesting for participants. So maybe developing some short stories where there's like a different story for each of the positions. So there's 4 stories for God's power and providence, each one showing the one of the different positions, and then participants only read one of those stories so that they don't confuse the different positions. Because we need to do something with our methodology because it didn't work that well this time. I mean, we have a lot to do with our data that we have currently that we haven't gotten to it yet, so I don't know if there's going to be some questions about that we might not be able to answer. Because we want to look at a bunch of different things. We want to look at the degradation and performance as our dependent variable rather than just straight performance on time 2, like how much worse did people do on time 1 versus time 2. We want to look at how the items changed. So did they take the maximally counterintuitive concepts and make them more minimally counterintuitive concepts, as Boyes and Barrett's theory suggests that people do? Is there a relationship between denomination, so controlling for denomination and what people already say? So they say, oh yeah, I already hold the Augustinian view of God's power and providence. Would that influence it? We suspect it would. So, yeah.
Yes, Myron.
So it seems like the project is kind of hampered right at the start for reasons that you already suggested in terms of, like, as soon as you introduce God, you now already are introducing something that's NCI.
Yeah.
So it seems like that's kind of the wrong to try and map the MCI onto this kind of project, which is not to say that there's not something interesting. And in fact, he said something later, just right at the end about folk theology. Mm-hmm. So what if you used Barrett's kind of description of natural religion, right? Kind of a list of things on which there seems to be a convergence, and then had that as your baseline, right? Of kind of minimally counterintuitive kind of natural religion, and then with respect to your coding, you look at theological context, and you could even talk in terms of transfer and breach, but the baseline is now transfer and breach relative to natural religion. Absolutely. It wouldn't be MCI because you're already working with a baseline, right? But you're now talking about maybe religiously counterintuitive, so the RCI or something like that. Yeah. And you can kind of come up with a parallel coding scheme that doesn't attempt to reproduce exactly the MCI.
No. When he was talking last night, I wrote these things down. I put a big star next to it and said, "Look at this." So, yeah, I think. John.
You maybe already said this, and I just couldn't pick it up. When you did the scoring, the dependent variable here, was it the score on the matching test or on the writing down of the
short answer.
And so, how did you score that?
Well, we read them.
And we scored them 0, 1, 2, 3, I think. Yeah. Had 2 different scores for everything, and then kind of had a third score looking whenever there was a discrepancy, and so.
And then I think you said this in your conclusions there, that maybe another way to look at it is to look at the difference between time 1 and time 2, because maybe some were just hard to remember by the wording or whatever.
Yeah, and I suspect that for a lot of them, if they didn't remember it on time 1, they're definitely not going to remember it on time 2. So.
Did you correct I think I remember at time 1, they had to learn them, and then they had to do the quiz, and then they had to write the short answer down. Did you correct their incorrect? You did?
Yeah, for the matching quiz, we corrected it as a group, so we went over
it. But then when they wrote the short answer, did you correct when they got that wrong?
Not with them. Like, that's what we
But no,
looked at.
that's the point that I think it might be an issue that you want to not do in the next time, is that if the last thing they wrote down was something incorrect, they're going to remember what was incorrect rather than what was correct.
But that's kind of part of the point of our study, to see what they remembered, and if they remembered the minimally counterintuitive concepts, or if they didn't remember the maximally counterintuitive concepts because they were so counterintuitive.
Yeah, I know, but I think you're wanting to.
Yeah.
I mean, you got some memory issues as well.
And one way we could correct for that is to look at the difference scores between time 1 and time 2, which we didn't do, and we could do that, or we could correct them as soon as they finish the time 1 so that they could get the right
That's
one.
what I would suggest.
Last question right up here.
You alluded at the end denominational differences and how that might affect the outcome of your research. But I noticed, so on the effects of sin one, especially, that was one that correlated, correct? Was that one?
We didn't do the correlation.
Sorry, that was one that you found success.
Yes.
So it seems to me that the Arminian and the Reformed view is going to be the dominant view in almost all denominations that you find, where you're not going to find the Pelagian view expressed as much. So I guess how are you planning on accounting for that? Because I feel like a lot of Christians who would participate in the study might be aware of kind of the debate between Arminian and Reformed theology, but might not even be aware of this outlier. And that seems to be something that might be hard to control for.
Well, and that's the practice naturalist issue that intrudes here in ways that are inevitable and annoying.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Yes.
If our reading group was graphed, I would be the outlier on the graph. I'm a theological educator, and there were two of us who came out of the background of theology. To give you an idea of the effect that this has had on me, every time I have gone back home to be with my faculty, they have said, "Stop hanging out with those people. We have no idea what you're talking about." And what I want to talk to you about is some of the applications of this. First, I'm going to talk about where I was this time last year. And one of the challenges of doing this is that the more I read, the more the ground keeps shifting, and the more I keep thinking, you know, if I focus my energy in that direction, it's not going to create the kind of dialogue with theologians that was one of the things I was interested in doing here. So at the end of last year, I was all excited about putting CSR into dialogue with a kind of somewhat obscure Canadian Jesuit thinking, a guy named Bernard Lonergan. And Lonergan was a theologian, a philosopher, and an economist, brilliant guy, who was really concerned about theology's inability to be able to find a common methodology that theologians could share. And he was jealous of the scientific method. So he thought if he could work on human consciousness, he might be able to figure out some kind of a common methodology that all theologians could share in, and we could at least begin to get kind of a benchmark of having a common ground somewhere. So I kind of designed this, you know, very attractive design here. And Lonergan was working in the 50s with what he referred to as depth psychology, which was really way before a lot of the kind of tools that now exist for being able to study how the human mind works and brain. So he came up really with 5 different conscious activities, consciousness operations. One was empirical, gathering data. The other was thinking about it. There was the intellectual of actually understanding the concepts, the rational of wrestling with it, the responsive of making a decision, and then love, which was at the core of consciousness, which of course God is love. And when he got to that point, which took him about, all told, 3 books and 1,900 pages to be able to get to it, he realized, I don't know anything about this. You have to go talk to people who are married or monks because they're the experts in love. And then he got very sick and he was not able to do any more with that. Moved to Toronto. I understand, I actually know a Jesuit. He developed a crush on Goldie Hawn at the end of his life, laughing. And a group of Jesuit scholastics, one who I knew, actually wrote to the show laughing to get a poster, which you can make a lot of money in Catholic circles if you could ever find that poster, because it showed up, and I don't know what it had on there. Thanks for being a fan, Bernie, love Goldie, or whatever. But if he was alive, he would be very interested in CSR if he hadn't run off with Goldie to marry her. The problem with this is I kept reading this past year, and the more I kept reading, the more I started realizing that if I wrote something like this, it would be great for my Vita, but I don't need anything on my Vita, and it wouldn't create much of a conversation. So I started rethinking, for the third time, exactly what to do with what I've learned over the past 2.5 years, and also to try to think in a way in which when I talk to my colleagues, they don't say, we don't know what you're talking about. And frankly, I can't do that without the help of the people who are researching CSR, because what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the problem of dialoguing from a theological and religious education perspective with CSR, talk about some of the impediments to the dialogue, and then make some suggestions on some research projects which may be impossible to do, but if you could do them, it would actually open up a window for being able to have a conversation. So to begin, we throw around the word, and the literature throws around the word theology frequently, and religion. And it's used for a theologian, it's used in a way that doesn't have anywhere near enough discrimination. So there's various ways of looking at religion from a theological perspective. All of them have different methodologies. All of them have different, the people that are involved in them have different type of characteristics that make them suited to what they're doing. And all of them actually could benefit from CSR, elements of CSR, if they could find a way to access the information. So I'm making a distinction between religious education and theological education, and this is applicable for most denominations, certainly within Christianity. Not all of them, but I think most. And you've really got a whole series of different types of ways of approaching what religion is about and trying to engage people. At the theological level, you really have, there should be 4 up there. Undergraduate, academic graduate, practical theology, and religious studies. I come out of the practical theology. So my particular way of looking at religion is we're always asking the question, so what? Because this is an applied field. And it's the kind of theology that gives a Master's of Divinity degree or a Doctorate of Ministry degree, which is a practitioner. So it's similar to an MBA, probably more than anything else. And actually, I think all 4 of these have ways in which they can intersect with CSR, but fruitfully. Religious studies seems to be the one that's the most intrigued by this, the few that are interested. And that's a kind of a separate category, particularly from this. And I think the practitioners are where this information has to sometime, some way, somewhere begin to intersect. Because the more I've read, the more I've become aware that it's kind of like a food researcher only talking with people who cook at home and never paying a visit to Julia Childs or to master chefs. And it's a tricky thing because theologians are a quirky group. If you'll keep that private and don't say that I share that. But the field is really, it's got some unique pressure points, and it also looks at religion very differently than virtually everybody in this room. I mean, the way we look at it is closest to the philosophers, but even there, it's very, very different. So if you look at it this way, and I'll just run through a couple of these things because this is just some of the profound possibilities for an interchange and a dialogue of information. So I'll just use HAT, which I see as a concept that you could address the capacity to discern spiritual experience. You can use it for an interpretive tool for making sense of early Christian experiences. The speculation on the process of how revelation actually came about. Rudolf Otto's Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans, which is the whole experience of the sacred, and what does that actually, how does that play out within people's lives? In practical theology course, you spend a lot of time talking about that because as a minister, a chaplain, or somebody who's actually in pastoral ministry, you have to help people understand these had experiences that they're having. And in a religious education framework, you've got to be somewhat careful about this, because if you're seeing secret agents floating around everywhere, that works okay, and I don't have a problem with it theologically, at a certain age. So it was typical in Catholic households in the 60s to have first graders to try to teach them God's presence and protection. They would have them slide over in their seat to make room for their guardian angel. Now this is with first graders. My wife named hers Angus, and I think he had an image of some Braveheart character who was looking out over her. Now, I don't have a problem with that, but theologically, as the person matures, you obviously have to start helping them question appropriately what those experiences are, what they mean, and what they're indicative of. So everybody...
You would have grabbed the handle. Your lapel cut out. You would have grabbed the
I
handle.
suspect the battery died.
Was it cut?
It was low.
Yeah, I'm okay. Okay, sorry.
A little low battery.
Okay, promiscuous teleological reasoning. A concept for addressing theological concepts like salvation history, vocation, the call of vocation. Almost everybody who ends up on our doors to become a student with us felt like they were called to come to that place, and they've had all kinds of experiences that have led them in that direction. And part of our challenge is helping them discern, and then particularly with those who clearly don't have any kind of a call to this kind of work. Discernment of complicated situations, helping people in situations in which they're facing health, death issues, trying to interpret what that all means in their life, and to negotiate through that. Deeply, deeply significant for my line of work in several areas of that. Maturational and practice naturalness, concept addressing the scope and sequence of religious education texts. That whole trajectory of moving from maturational to practice is contained in the scope and sequence of every religious education textbook. Why we're doing it the way we're doing it is predicated mostly on Piaget's thought and a few other people, but it's actually very dated research, and the people who are doing it, for the most part, don't know why they're doing it. They're completely detached from the theory that they're applying. So, and as I'm sure you know, most religious educators are volunteers. Most of them are not theologically trained. They've had religious education. They have a limited grasp of the tradition. And that works, sort of, because what they're doing is something different than what theologians are doing. They're trying to help people access the faith tradition in the level of detail that they need to help them live a good and holy life. I mean, that's the intent of it. So the outcomes are actually quite different. Mentally counterintuitive concepts. Identification of the concepts most difficult to understand within theology and religious education. Critically difficult problem. As you're trying to pace the cognitive load in a particular class, theologically it gets to be really, really complicated on how much heavy, really counterintuitive stuff students can handle without going into overload. If they're dealing with systematic theology, they're in overload for the whole semester, or for the quarter, just in general anyway. So it gets really to be really complicated. This is also, though, I think is really critical for certain streams of theological education, but also ministerial preparation and actual ministry. Because this this concept and the research that's been worked on it is actually really important for spiritual direction, for mentoring, which is key to theological education if you're going to be doing anything with it, other than teaching it, and particularly for contextual education, in which case you go out to do ministry someplace, you end up taking what you've learned, put it in dialogue with who you are and what you've learned about yourself, and what you're learning from the ministerial situation, and then you rethink your theology as a result of all that. So, and then non-reflective, how am I going to Okay, so reflective and non-reflective beliefs, what Liz was talking about with meditation, contemplation, confession, holy conversation, what the Quakers, their clearness committees, are all things that the reflective, non-reflective beliefs, that's what you're really doing in those situations. You're attempting to try to pull out of the fast thinking, to pull it up into the conscious mind where you can actually look at it, think about it, critique it, change your theology. So, I think I had. So doctrine and imagistic religiosity, cultural input on religious practice, the organizational structures flowing from theological beliefs and rituals, the role of tradition within the religious tradition, and then particularly, which is a big issue with almost everybody in theology, is religious identity, because we're moving into a hyphenated belonging period, and a period in which what religious identity is no longer fits the template that most of us grew up with. And then lastly, theological correctness and incorrectness, generational and the cultural imprint of theological discourse. So I can send this to you if you guys are somehow interested in it. So I used this thing last year, but I had theology's pre-Enlightenment inferiority complex, and I suggested that perhaps one of the reasons a dialogue hasn't happened is because theology, after the Enlightenment, lost its role as queen of the sciences, got a secondary position in the academy, and was still trying to deal with it, and so didn't want to get into the ring with a monster that was considerably bigger. As I've read over the past year, I think there's, in approaching this, a lot of CSR researchers actually are reflecting their pre-Enlightenment inferiority complex by the way they're addressing theology. Because the theology they're addressing, oftentimes, is a theology I don't know. And I've been doing this for a pretty long time. So you got the four horsemen who are using some of this data, and they're misusing it often. I mean, in the God delusion, Justin is quoted, and kind of the way it's positioned, the way Dawkins positions it, it almost sounds like you agree with Dawkins. I mean, I don't know if you've seen that passage, but so what they're doing is they're actually taking the research, they're using it for their own ends, and it's actually theologians who are even familiar with this literature assume that CSR kind of comes out of this perspective, which they know is nonsense, just from a cursory look at it. In the paperback edition of Dawkins' God Delusion, he actually responds to something on his blog where somebody's asked him, you don't seem to put whatever it is you're trying to say in dialogue with any serious theologians. And he mentions, like Paul Tillich, he mentions Jürgen Moltmann. And so what Dawkins ends up saying is, well, you know, there's such a minuscule amount. Most people who are religious they're just not representative of the people that are out there. So they're just kind of like casually dismissed. Theologians, so at any rate, even with some of the more serious work, the visual of it, from a theologian's perspective, if you look at the believing primate, the people who participated in that text, which I think was a very good one, you had 5 philosophers, 5 psychologists, 3 biologists, 1 sociologist, 1 physician, an anthropologist, a religious studies professor, and 1 theologian. So that constitutes, since you guys are all into numbers, that's 5% of the writers. So Nancy Murphy, who I think you're with, actually went back to the old theology as queen of the sciences and kind of the integrative discipline. I lost one of my slides here. The theologian was a guy named John Haidt. He's a Jesuit. And John did exactly what I would expect most theologians to do in countering CSR research. He immediately got on a plane, flew up to 50,000 feet, and spent the whole time in his chapter talking about the faith-science debate. And knowledge is something, we're going after different types of knowledge, and we're separate from each other. So he didn't engage CSR research specifically and look at the theological implications of it at all. So let me look at just, you have the 4 horsemen, but you have more subtle things that kind of pop up. So Gervais and Norazayan, who we've heard from twice already, they make 2 references to theologians in the text that I think, I mean, this is your field for you who are psychologists, but this article got way more attention than it deserves. They make two references: Thomas Aquinas and Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Great books in the history of theology. One was written in the 13th century, the other was written in the 19th century. I mean, in reading it as a theologian, you would think, oh, well, they don't think we've done any serious thinking since at least the 19th century. Here's Jason Sloan, who's a religious studies professor, I think, from my hometown, which To account for, and so here's what he's doing when he approaches it though. To account for why people do what they do and think what they think, we're better off employing a scientific method because neither the insider's views nor folk psychology will work. Science proves to be much more useful because it reaches below the surface. Any theologian, particularly in my area of theology, would, if they read this, they would immediately stop reading at that particular point, and they would set it aside. Theological education has use of all kinds of ways of helping students get below the surface. It is the point in practical theology that you have to spend most of your time trying to do. So, and there's techniques for doing it. I mean, in my Catholic world, probably the most significant one is the spiritual exercises that Ignatius of Loyola created, the founder of the Jesuits. Incredibly psychologically sophisticated for the 16th century, been used for centuries to help people get below the surface in their own life, to find peace in their life, discern directions in their life, all kinds of things. So now I think I know what he was trying to say, but from a theological perspective, it would suggest to say that the scientific method is the arbiter of all claims to truth. And a theologian on basic principle would say, and we're not just talking about revelation here, we're talking about human experience, at least for many of traditions. So this is another article I read by Blanky and a number of other people in which they make a reference to evolutionary theory, the way Catholics think about it. They quote John Paul II speaking to the Pontifical Academy of the Sciences about evolution, and then they kind of designate to him that he's trying, but he's caught in essentialist and teleological intuitions that kind of prevent him from being able to fully grasp the concept. Problem with that is, and I had my problems with John Paul with some things, but he was a continental philosopher who was very nuanced in his thought. To take a little snippet about evolutionary theory, ascribe it to the whole Catholic tradition, when the Catholic tradition has actually been dealing with it since an encyclical Humani Generis that was published in 1950, is a kind of a really crass characterization of somebody's thought. So all of this to say, theologians need some way of being able to engage the issues that they're actually dealing with. And so I'm just going to give you two quick quotes, and then I'll make some suggestions on maybe strategies. Many of you probably know Brian McLaren, and there was a book that he wrote, A Generous Orthodoxy. And when we think in terms of when you think in terms of religious concepts, we often think of them as being very static. And Laird, what you guys are trying to do, you're trying to do with static concepts. Well, you have McLaren writing A Generous Orthodoxy, where I am a missional, plus evangelical, plus post-Protestant, plus liberal conservative, plus mystical poet, plus biblical, charismatic, contemplative, fundamentalist Calvinist. These categories don't fit with one another. And yet the religious reality is that people are living within some kind of reality that's different than static conceptions of what that is. This one's even more complicated. A Catholic Hindu Christian scholar, a guy named Panakar. I left as a Christian, found myself a Hindu, and I returned as a Buddhist without ever having ceased to be a Christian. What does that mean? Well, as theologians, we're wrestling with what that means, and we don't know what it means either, but we know that people are experiencing it, and some of us have actually experienced it too. So, fishing project, we're trying to get theologians involved. There's three traditions that CSR can build on. One is by James Michael Lee, who focused on religious education. The other, and actually wrote a ton of stuff that very few people reacted to. He thought religious education was a social science, not a theological enterprise. Lawrence Kohlberg, who came up with a developmental moral, many of you probably know him, he ended up being integrated into a lot of religious education textbooks. A lot of theologians have been in dialogue with Kohlberg's ideas. And then lastly, James Fowler, who probably most religious education textbooks by large companies have somehow made use of Fowler's work. And I'm not so sure Fowler's work is as good as, or is as reliable as it's often presented. But so here's a suggested probe. That's the first one. Here's the second one. Theological correctness studied across different levels of practice, naturalness, I should say. Sorry, spell check. Those receiving identifiable dimensions of education, seasoned ministers, those trained in spiritual direction and theological reflection, particularly those who lead in complex, stressful, pastoral situations. The idea behind this is that if you've had a really good theological education on this trajectory, what ends up happening to that intuition, that intuitive conceptual framework that you use of religious? Do you revert back to it the way a lot of the people who've been studied in some of the studies that CSR has been doing? Or have you actually rethought your theology to a point that even under highly stressful situations, you actually now have that practiced naturalness? I would submit that we do, and I could list a whole bunch of people as examples of that. Here's another one, and then I got one more. Mapping onto theological theory with CSR's relevance. There's two ways of carving up what the church is and how it operates in the world that I think there's a lot of relevance, and it's pretty commonly known by theologians. One is Reinhold Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, in which he looked at 5 models of the church through history that are very different from one another. The other is Avery Dulles' Models of the Church, which actually looked at 5 different models of the way churches operate internally and emphasize certain parts of the Christian tradition. And then lastly, and this one is something that it becomes more apparent to me every time I come, because we keep making reference to Reformed epistemology. So I don't know how much CSR researchers have got into dialogue with the Catholic epistemology, which I talked about last time. For Catholic with a small c, the Second World War was a game changer for everybody. What happened with the death camps? Everybody started thinking about theology from an experiential way. Some theologians refer to it as an anthropological turn in the way we do theology. So doctrinal and imagistic transmission principles operate simultaneously within this kind of a structure. There's a both-or orientation rather than an either-or. There's a heavy orientation of integrating maturational and practice naturalness, by that spell check, as much as by intuition as by conscious choice. So this is kind of a different way of looking at religion, which frankly, it seems to me actually has a lot more possibility of really fruitful dialogue, because it gets into the experience, which is the mental operations that CSR is trying to track. Actually, it's closer to the action, I guess, in a way, I would say. So that's all I've got. I can leave on this.
Well,